What does it truly take to lead in a world that's constantly evolving? How can we futurize leadership while keeping it deeply human? And what does it mean for women to lead unapologetically in today's workplace? Hello, everyone. This is Jason Smith. I lead the growth for the UK, Europe, and North American regions at KNOLSKAPE. And I welcome you all to another episode of The Learning Curve, powered by KNOLSKAPE. Today on The Learning Curve, we're diving deep into these questions with a powerhouse of wisdom from Dr. Alison Maitland, a psychologist, leadership coach, and champion for developing women leaders. With over 40 years of experience working across global businesses, sports teams, and high-performance environments, Alison has seen firsthand what makes leaders thrive and what holds them back. From her PhD in elite performance psychology to working on the bench as a sports psychologist for a Super League netball team, Alison blends science with real-world leadership insights. She has coached everyone from fresh graduates to C-suite executives, helping them navigate change, build resilience, and embrace leadership with confidence. Hi, Alison. It's great to have you with us today and on the Learning Curve.
It's lovely to be here, Jason. I'm not sure I can live up to that. What a lovely introduction. Thank you.
No, I was looking through before we started this. I did have a quick glimpse at your LinkedIn and saw some of the history. It's very impressive, and I know we've got a rich conversation today, one that I'm genuinely curious about as well. And so before we start any of these, though, Alison, we always like to start with a quick rapid fire questions just to get your take and ease us into the conversation. If you're up for it, I can shoot those over to you and get your responses.
Absolutely, go for it.
Okay, let's do it. So, one thing you'd tell your 25-year-old self.
Oh, I love those sorts of questions. Oh, yeah, I'd probably tell my 25-year-old self to just relax into it. You'll get somewhere. It won't look anything like you thought when you were 25, but it's all right.
Yeah, I like that. Okay. And the best advice you ever received as a leader?
Yeah, I've been a leader for such a long time. I won't remember all of them. Actually, one that was relatively recent for me was when I started to run my own business. I have a small business doing women's leadership development. And someone said to me, just don't be a sole trader. You're just like anybody else. Think about yourself as a business and what you have to offer, what the problem is, and kind of back yourself to set yourself up as someone who has, more than just yourself to offer. You have a product, you have some thought leadership underneath it, you have all of that. So yeah, that was a great piece of advice, certainly for the last 5 years as I've been running a business.
Nice. And a leadership myth you wish to bust forever? What's some of the leadership myths you want to just bust and chuck away?
Well, one's really relevant to what we're talking about today, which is that, women and men are different in terms of their leadership. You'll always find a different man to a different woman, but there's as much difference within men and within women as there is across the crossover between men and women. So yeah, let's blow that one out of the water, shall we?
Yes, and I know we'll go into more depth today on that one. And another quick fire question: what's a small daily habit that improves leadership effectiveness? Anything you've seen or use yourself, maybe?
Yes. So it comes from the basis of the work I do, which is using acceptance and commitment therapy as an underpinning to my practice in what we teach people, but how I work with athletes, which is to notice what's going on for you. What are my thoughts? What are my feelings? Okay, if I can notice that and name it, gives me a bit of a choice to go, okay, now I've noticed that I'm like now, yeah, with a bit of a voice going, oh, why am I on the podcast? Am I an expert? I've got a bit of a feeling of anxiety, a little bit in here. If I can notice and name that, I go, okay, yeah, that's understandable. I'm on a podcast. Someone's asking me some questions. I need to think on my feet. I might mess up. Yeah. So I can take a deep breath, push my feet in the floor and go on. But that is perfect in any situation, is to be able to do that.
Yeah, and we all have that, don't we? What you described there, some of that imposter syndrome a little bit, and things creep into our minds, and so no, I think that's really useful. And the final one that I'm going to just fire at you is what's next on your bucket list, either personal or professional?
Oh, mm, well, this is a bit of a random one.
Yeah, go on.
It might not stretch too much outside the UK, although actually you find these things everywhere. Is I play in a brass band, and
Okay.
we're about to go to a competition where if we do really well, we've got the opportunity to go to the national championships. I've never done that in my playing time, so yeah, that would be on my bucket list to go to the national championships and play with the best brass. We were quite low down in the brass band rankings, but
Yeah,
yeah, to play with the best brass bands
I
around.
like that. That's very different. Haven't had that one yet. So
Yeah.
no, thank you.
Not
No.
many nerdy brass band players around, probably in leadership, but there we go.
No, that's brilliant. And thank you for that, Alison. That's been really helpful, just to get us started. And I want to get right into the sort of the meat of the conversation now, and the topic of today. I'm always curious around topics such as this. I've been in leadership for a long time in terms of leadership development, so to speak. But this has been a topic that keeps coming up, and I really want to get your expertise, your insight into this. And the first question that popped to my mind was, how have specific societal and organizational contexts impacted your own professional journey? Because I know that's going to have an impact to where you are today, but would love to hear more from you about that.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting to think about that. So I'm the daughter of a working mother, so that in itself has shaped me as, my approach to starting work I started work in the 1980s.
Yeah.
And if I think about, what has changed in that period, so we didn't get the Equal Pay Act or the Sex Discrimination Act until 1975. So just before I started work, while I was still at school, some of these really quite momentous changes for women came into play. And my first job actually trained weirdly in banking and finance. That's my degree kind of background. And I remember being in the branch and picking up, the staff handbook, and it was an old one from quite some time ago, and it had this thing called the Marriage Act in it, which that's called the Marriage Bar. Sorry, the Marriage Bar,
Yeah.
and it's where women were not allowed once they got married to stay working particularly in professional organisations, and the banks actually didn't remove that until the late 50s and early 60s. And I remember standing there as a sort of a 21-year-old thinking, oh my goodness, in my lifetime, there were people like me who, if we got married, couldn't work anymore. So that really kind of blew me away. And that, I think, got me thinking, okay, what are women's experiences in work? And at the bank at the time that I worked for, they're part of HSBC, had a career break scheme of 5 years, which at that point in the 1980s was revolutionary, that you could have 5 years off and come back. And I remember thinking as a fresh-faced 21-year-old, oh, it's going to be so easy to be a woman leader. It's going to be really easy to do that. And of course, I've realized now, 40 years later, that that's not the case. Women have
Yeah.
different experiences, and no doubt we'll come on to that. So yeah, that's kind of my journey. And then, as you say, maybe we'll come on to that in a minute. Yeah, the current environment is interesting.
Yes. Yeah, and we'll get into that. And thank you. It's really good to just hear about your journey, I guess, because everyone's got a unique journey, but specifically as you come to this point, and what brought you to obviously the topic more and more within this. But the other, I guess, from a naive standpoint, and I know some of our listeners will be thinking this, but why do we need the focus in developing women leaders now? Have we not fixed that? Is there something still out there? Is it still an issue? What's going on there? What's your take on that?
Yeah, no, I wish I could say that we didn't
Mm,
need to do this anymore. That would be really great. And we do. I mean, in the UK, the government is quite good. We have the requirement for companies to provide a gender pay gap report. And if you look at the gender pay gap reports, there still is a gender pay gap, and it's particularly increases as women get older, as they get into more senior positions where they should be being paid more, they're
yeah.
not. So that's, it has got better over the last 10 years, but that still is a problem, and it's particularly true in the higher paid professions. So if you look at the reports, you go down to places where people don't earn a lot of money, the gap is tiny. But in places where there's an opportunity for women to earn a really good living, then the gap is really still quite significant, 20%, 30%. It's not a small number in terms of that opportunity. And, or you look at some of the headline stuff, we often see that in the newspaper around women on boards.
Yeah.
Big strides have been made in that. In theory, around about 43% of boards now have a woman, although often they're the non-exec. Only about 35% of executive board members are women still. And if you kind of look outside at who are the chairs of FTSE 350 companies, it's only 17% of them are women. Actually, the UK does quite well. France does better, supposedly out of the sort of G7 countries. So some of those thoughtful countries that you think should be doing pretty well. So still quite a long way to go in terms of what we need to do.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was going to ask about regions and countries and whether there was a difference there from your experience, and also industries. Are you seeing that certain industries more and more so have much wider gaps, and what are you seeing in that space as well?
Yeah, if I take industries particularly, because it's really easy to see that. It's often as you expect. You look at how their sort of pyramid of employees stacks up, and at the bottom, did a really great job of recruiting and hiring women engineers, into spaces where women are not traditionally being recruited. And still, you get that pyramid where when you get to the top, the upper quartile kind of roles in an organization, it switches completely, and you have more men than women. So we've still got almost like there's different words for it, but that almost like that cliff that women fall off in terms of their progression, which is usually somewhere in their early 30s and onwards. So if you speak to a young woman, someone in their 20s, my daughter's in her mid-20s working for a big company, all lovely, plain sailing, not a problem. It's once you get after that, and maybe we'll come on to some of the reasons for that you then start to get women have different experience of what it's like to be a leader in organizations.
Yeah, I want to track that for a moment, because I think that's really important as you go into it, because the question that still pops up in my mind is why? Why at that piece? Now, there's an obvious element that pops into my mind, which is that the typical age in which there's a level of women become pregnant, they take some time out from work to raise a family at that point, and that's a perception, or there's some legacy biases and perceptions at that point. But again, I'd love to get your take. What is it about that area within people's careers, or women in their careers specifically, that's causing some of that?
It's really quite complex. I wish it wasn't. I wish there was an easy answer that said, it's just because women have children and step out. And if you think about an average person has 2 point whatever it is children, maternity leave is generally a year. That's not a massive long time to be out of the workplace. So it's not just about that. And though it's about all the things that go around that. So there's still, we know from statistics in terms of flexible working, more women are going to work part-time compared to men. Yeah, we know that the opportunity to work flexibly, whilst women want it, there's some good stats around the EU do a equality index, and one of them is around who has the opportunity to take time off to flex their time. And ironically, it's men who have more opportunity to do that than women, who, rightly or wrongly, still take the burden of childcare, elder care, other caring responsibilities. So there is some of that going on, but there's also something called second generation bias, because I think we've done a lot of really good work around those sort of overt discrimination. It was 1975 when we brought the Sex Discrimination Act in, so we've had a long time to learn how not to be biased overtly in the workplace. We kind of know how to do that now, but there are other things which are like hidden biases, for want of a better word. I don't really like the word bias, but they're not purposeful, but it's the way that organizations work that are still gendered. So something might be like, there's good data that says women get more critical feedback than men. Yeah, so the organization is focusing on the limitations of women, not on what they can do. They're also perceived to have less potential than men. Okay, that's, yeah, we can come on to some of that in a minute. Yet they're seen as less suitable for leadership than men. Or there's even some good evidence around, if women talk a lot, they're seen as kind of controlling and less competent compared to men who talk a lot in meetings and in situations. So there's that kind of almost like hidden bias that's sitting there in organizations that also gets in the way of women developing as leaders. But you've also got to think about the whole social environment that women grow up, what they're told, the toys that they're given, the expectations. So for example, there's a nice piece of research which is about, if you could do this experiment and you could not be identified as being a man or a woman, what women do is they behave more like they want to be, and actually they're more assertive and aggressive than the men, because that suddenly you're stripping away the notion that as a woman I have to behave in a certain way. This is how I'm expected to be in society, at work. Similarly, if you give people, it's another study on maths tests, give you a maths test, and if you say to the women, oh, actually there's gender differences in maths tests, the group are told that and half of the group are not told that, guess what? Half of the group that are told there are gender differences don't do very well on the maths tests. And the other half, who are not told that, do just as well as the men. Yeah. So there's all of this kind of hidden stuff that still shapes women's experiences, women's lives, the expectation of women. So sorry, that's a long answer to.
No, that's so interesting. It's so interesting because it's funny, you gave some examples there, and it rang true for some of the conversations I've been having. It's interesting. I had a conversation with a very large bank. I know that you mentioned that as part of it, but even from a sense of biases, where one of the biggest challenges around that were projects. For instance, certain projects weren't given to women in leadership because of some of those things that you just described. And it makes me think, as you say there, that there's, as with many of these things, it's not a silver bullet or a magic wand that can solve this. There's some deep-rooted systemic things that have created this as part of it. And it made me think about, so as you're working inside organizations at the moment, is there a strong focus even on the language being used? Because you referenced some examples there where certain language is used, and that sort of emphasizes a potential challenge or roadblock as part of that.
Yeah, absolutely. No, there's often a limitation on how we describe men and women. So if you just think about, women are seen as bitchy, or they're not allowed, they're seen as aggressive, whereas men are seen as questioning and assertive. So yes, there's even some simple things that just attributed to the gendered nature of how we see, society. What are traditional masculine behaviors and what are traditional feminine behaviors? And there's a bit of a dividing line we don't like to cross. And when someone crosses those, we give them another label, which isn't they're a leader.
Yeah. Got you. And do you think since the pandemic, and you see this throughout history, when there's something that is significant that happens and changes or creates some confusion or complexity in the environment that we live in, often shifts things. And I wonder whether the pandemic and things like hybrid working and the changes in work patterns, things like that, have had a big impact on perceptions of women's leadership. Has that been something you've seen again working with organizations?
Yeah, no, it's a really great question, that, because I think what the pandemic did is it opened up possibility for women, because suddenly, whereas organizations had fought against them having the flexibility to meet all of their needs and do a really great job, as we've come out of the pandemic, and we've seen it in the last 12 months, and particularly since the beginning of this year, organizations mandating, in fact, I had someone on the program just the other day being mandated. They've been hired up in Scotland for an organization that was headquartered in the Midlands, and suddenly been told they had to come back to work. And she's going, how am I going to do my job and do that? It's impossible for me. So yeah, if we go back to women's experiences, because they're shouldering most of the family responsibilities, yeah, it makes it
Yeah.
really difficult for them to be successful. But I mean, also things like we've seen, some of the rollbacks of D&I policies. People like PepsiCo, Google, Citigroup,
Yeah.
they've removed their hiring targets. And the thing is, if you don't get the women in at the bottom, they're not going to come up to the top. So that's an interesting one to see how that's going to play out. And also some of the sort of misogynistic behaviors that appear to be acceptable in certain cultures and certain places. AI, so there's lots that can still shape women's experiences. There's never going to be a straight trajectory. Think about, AI assessment of behaviors. If it's AI is trained on the data that's available, that may not play out well for women leaders.
I was going to ask you about that. You referenced some of the organizations there that are shifting their policies and the way they're seeing even things around diversity, equity, and inclusion as part of this. And there's a political landscape now that is also sort of playing a role and shifting this, and how big a role you see that playing out in the future. And I think you touched on it there, but anything you would add in terms of what you're seeing out there that is having an impact or will have an impact for the future of women in leadership?
Yeah, I think if we go back to probably one of the fundamentals that I would ascribe to, and there's good data on that as well, that broadly women are not different to men. They're the same. They have the same abilities to to lead, to speak out, to communicate, to be confident, etc. So if you start from that basis, what we're seeing is a different set of experiences for women. And I think that's what's interesting about this environment. And we're always to hold in our hand. Women are not broken. They don't need fixing. They're perfectly capable as they are. It's just they sit in an environment where it's really quite difficult to be yourself and to lead with the skill that you want to lead with. So, and I think this shifting environment is just causing us to go, oh, heck, what does that look like?
Is there anything where like I think about some of the things I hear out there, and uh, you could maybe describe them as a little bit misogynistic in terms of what comes out, uh, and there's some emphasis around almost opposing to what you've just said there, which we are the same, and thoughts out there which are saying, well, actually, men and women are different in certain aspects, and therefore we should be leveraging that as part of what we do going forward. What would you say to that? Because yeah, it's almost like an opposing argument to what you've just shared there.
Yeah, there was a book that was really powerful. I forget when it was written, maybe in the 90s, maybe a bit before that. Men are from Mars, women are from Venus. I don't know if you ever came across. Yeah, it rolled out as being good research since then. There's a great book by a lady called Cordelia Fine, which is title escapes me for the moment. If I think of it, I'll tell you. She's was an Oxford professor. Good research going, actually, that's not the case broadly. And in fact, back in 2005, a woman called Janet Hyde for the American Psychological Society did a meta-analysis of the meta-analyses looking at gender differences. And she went, okay, let me see if there's much difference between men and women. And what she came down to was they're not. They're basically their personalities, their thinking ability, their leadership across them as groups is broadly the same. Of course, within them, you and I would meet, we'll be different individuals. We'll operate in a different way. But it's not because I'm a woman and you're a man. It's because you're Jason and I'm Alison.
Yeah.
And if we put other people in the mix, we get that. And you could see that amongst a group of men. And I would see that against a group of women. So we are broadly similar, and we're also uniquely unique. And as a collective, women experience different things. That's kind of my perspective on how it is.
Well, it makes complete
Biologically,
sense.
not, no, don't go there.
No, it makes complete sense. And what you've shared there, I think, quite a few of the barriers that, the real barriers that are out there that still play a role today because of some of those biases or systemic reasons that have caused that. I'm wondering from Alison, in terms of your work and if you were to give advice to organizations that are looking to maybe dismantle some of these systemic barriers for women and tackle some of this, what sort of things would you suggest? Where would you start, and how would you think about this as a challenge?
Okay, that's quite a big question. Let me take the kind of the first bit, which I think is going back to what you asked me at the beginning about what was the myth I would bust. I think I'd start with that, because that's your starting point to go, actually, they're not different. It's just they've had different experiences, and sometimes women are stuck or they're knocked off track by what has happened to them. And we can do some work as an organization to work with that, but that's a bigger societal challenge as well. So let's not think we can solve world peace as an organization, but we can do our best. So I think that's the starting point. And then it's about unpicking some of those hidden aspects that we talked about. So blow away the myth that women are not committed to their job, because they are.
Yeah.
They want to do the best job that they can do. Yeah, but also often we have like a normative model of what potential looks like, and it's based around a set of behaviors. So lots of people might be very familiar with YSC's model of JDI, the judgment, drive, influence. Yeah, when you think about some of the ways of demonstrating that, they're very normatively come from a set of masculine behaviors, not necessarily ones that would fit across the way that women have been socialized to behave. So just hold that. I'm not saying that women are different, have a set of female behavior, but we've learned how to do those things. We've learned how to be pleasing. We've learned how to, fit in with the crowd. We've learned how to work as a team. We've learned all of that. That's part of our upbringing as women. It's not that we can't do the other things. It's just that's not, been our experience. That's often how women turn up in organizations.
Yeah.
So I'd start from that as a starting point.
And is there a way that you've seen best does that, Alison, in terms of a way or that you can approach that in terms of conversation, an area of the organization? Does it come from the top, or can it start in pockets inside the organization? What have you found is most effective?
Yeah, it's like a both and question. I think it has to, well, there's several bits to it. So one is equipping the women themselves to operate in an environment, in a context which, doesn't necessarily allow them to have the full range of their capability. So that's the work that we do at Becoming. We use acceptance and commitment therapy to go, okay, how can you learn to be on your firm ground, to use your voice in a way that's authentic to you, not how someone expects you to be, not how the organization thinks a leader should look like, but how do you want to lead in the full entirety of who you are and how you are. So that's one part of it. I think the other part is then having those who are in power in an organization to go, okay, how about if you were to look inside you? Why don't you do a little bit of internal work yourself to think about how you lead, how you use your power? How do you work collectively to make sure that you provide an environment that is fair and equitable and where people can belong and be themselves and. So I think there's some work for those senior leaders to do, and to really dig deep and think about themselves, not just go, oh yeah, I support this. Yeah, it's very different. And then I think there's some culture work to do to unpick how it is to experience work. And the interesting thing about kind of gendered behaviors is, a group of men, I'm generalizing, but a group of men who take traditional masculine behaviors towards leadership can take and learn some of those traditional gendered female behaviors. And women who lead with traditional gendered female behaviors can take and learn some of those traditional male behaviors. And so it's an integration of how you operate, not a Women, you need to ditch all of how you've learned to be, and you have to be like a man.
Sure.
Not man, you have to ditch like how you've learned to be and be like a woman, but them both, because they have something to offer each other. So it's a group learning in that respect.
Yeah. You touched on it there. I was thinking of leadership styles, and as you were talking about more of that inside out approach as well. How do I show up as a leader as part of that? And then also some of the more cultural things that we can do to help with that as well. But I was thinking, is there, and you did touch on it earlier, but specific women's leadership styles, or again, is that categorizing it again and saying that what you're doing there is creating a difference? Actually, it's the same. It's just we all are unique.
Yeah.
Unique as you described it.
Yeah. We use the metaphor. It's a lovely metaphor of like we were born to be a magnificent multi-roomed castle. That's how all of us were. You, me, anyone who's listening. And what happens in our lives is sometimes situations come along, people come along, and they tell us to close one of the rooms off. Oh, you couldn't be like that. Oh, Alison, you couldn't possibly sell. Oh, Alison, you couldn't possibly lead a big company. Oh, Jason, you couldn't possibly be empathetic. You shouldn't cry. Don't do any of that sort of stuff when you lead. Don't show any of that vulnerability as a leader. So you close rooms off. So each of us in our way has closed rooms off. They're just different rooms. We've been taught through societal, through parents, through teachers, through what we've read, through our own choices, to close some of those rooms off. And the work is to open back up those rooms.
Yeah, I love that as a sort of a metaphor to think about it. Actually, as you were describing, I was thinking of some of my own, which I've probably closed off and can think about there, which perhaps need opening again, or working on to get them open, if you like, and some of those things. So that's really useful to hear some of that. And again, from your perspective, what have been some of the big successes when you've done this inside organizations? Again, I just want to pull on your experience. What have you seen in terms of the impact that's had on organizations, for instance, and the effects that has had?
Yeah, it's interesting. So if I take an example of some of the places where we've operated, which is very much about equipping women to be themselves, it's almost like creating a movement of women who can support each other, but also can see there's an opportunity to step out as themselves, to find their voice, to, as I said before, to be on their firm ground, to think about the impact they want to have, to not get caught up in, you mentioned imposter thoughts and feelings, because they are just thoughts and feelings. They're not a medical condition. They are just thoughts and feelings. Yeah. Okay. Even with those imposter thoughts and feelings that we all have, again, you have them, I have them, man, women, doesn't matter. We all have them. Although we tend to pathologize them towards women. We often say that women have imposter syndrome stuff. But anyway, it's not true, again, in the data. To go, okay, I could spend all of my career getting caught up in those thoughts and feelings and letting them pull me around and stop me from having the career that I want to have, be the person that I want to be at work. Or I could just let those play on in the background and still take the actions I want to, apply for that job, speak up in a meeting, have the difficult conversation with my colleague, negotiate the deal, whatever it is that you need to do as a leader, set the strategy.
Yeah.
I think, so you asked me the question, sorry, what have I seen work? So I've seen that works really well when suddenly women can look around and go, oh, you're like me. And one of the things we often do with them when we first meet with them is we ask them to kind of share who they are. And they share some really vulnerable things about themselves. And they share that their journey to where they're at, whether in their 30s, their 50s, their 60s, whatever, it's been like this, their kind of career journey. And it's had ups and downs and side to sides and etc. And yet when they look at other people on the screen, they go, well, why are you here? And you're great. And you're really quite senior. And oh, I thought you were. It also helps them realize that nobody has got it all taped. And I think that's some of the problems that often when we do leadership development for women, we wheel out these heroic figures of women who we put on a pedestal.
Yeah.
And not fair to the women who we put on a pedestal, because we position them as something that they're not necessarily. They have to be then an influencer, an achiever, an inspiration. Well, they are sometimes, and sometimes I bet at home or somewhere else they're not one of those.
Yeah.
But also it limits then the women in our organization. We think, my goodness, the only way that I'm ever achieving my potential is if I'm one of those. Because actually, well, everyone, women included, can do some quite remarkable things just being themselves. And when you unpick their lives and who they are and all that they have done, they're pretty remarkable.
Yes. Yeah. It's so interesting you see that. Yeah, I mean, it's we talk about vulnerability in leadership in general now, don't we? Quite a bit, and the importance, I guess, of that in leadership. And still, yet you see a lot of that, putting people on a pedestal, or the superhero cape comes back on for those senior leaders, and we sort of put them almost in a, I don't know, an idle state, so to speak, which makes it very difficult to even, close that gap or think about that. Is there other things that you've seen inside organizations which, through all good intention, the intention there is to support and help, but it's actually become quite damaging and something to think about?
I think one of the, I'd say mentoring is one of those potentially. Again, with the best intentions, organizations put mentoring programs in for groups that maybe are a minority in their organization. Best of intentions, absolutely, super helpful. And they don't equip the people who are taking those mentoring programs. So let's stick with our women for the moment, to get the best out of them, because they've set the program up as almost like that sort of power over rescuer. Let's use that term, kind of rescuer. Oh, I'm the mentor. I'm coming in here. I'm not necessarily going to do anything different myself, but I might open a door for you, or I might help you with this, or I'll give you some of my time. And actually, there's a danger that that hasn't shifted the organization, hasn't shifted the mentor themselves, because they're part of the challenge of why women, get stuck on, knocked off track. But also, it doesn't equip the woman to go, do you know what? I've probably got quite a lot of these resources myself.
Yeah.
We had a woman on a program quite recently who, when you do the evaluation afterwards, we said, any other comments? She said, yeah. She said, what I've really realized from doing this work is that I was capable of all of this all along. We went, yeah, you were. You've just unblocked some of the things, the internal things in you that stopped you from stepping out beautifully as you, as a leader. Yeah. So I'd say, yeah, sometimes mentoring it has to be set up in the right way. Yeah. Otherwise, it just goes back to, that power over, that imbalance, just puts that back in place.
And I like what you're saying, Lass. There's a part of, I think, what I'm interpreting in hearing some of that, and because my next question was going to be around some of the big game changers you've seen in terms of women's leadership and thinking about that and developing women's leadership. But actually, what you've described there throughout, I'm hearing is it often starts with the individual and unblocking some of those mental barriers that have built up over time because of systemic reasons that are amplified because of some of the biases and myths that are out there. And actually, it starts with the individual starting to unpick some of those and debunk some of those to unleash some of that. Have I interpreted that correctly?
Yes,
Is that,
yeah, that's spot on, absolutely spot on. And it's often the opposite of what organizations are asking you to do, asking you to make this woman into something else because she's not something enough. Because actually, you said it beautifully. I won't. Yeah, perfect.
No, I love that. Thank you, Alison. Alison, this has been such an interesting and rich conversation. It's a lot broader and bigger. I know there's things that we haven't touched on and run out of time today, which we'd love to get you back on and explore some of these avenues and areas a bit further. But I know our listeners will really enjoy and take some great insight in terms of what you shared. I know I certainly have. I've been jotting down some notes as well and some things that you mentioned there. So I just want to say thank you for today. It's been a real pleasure. And to all of our listeners out there, if they were to connect with you, see some of your work, is LinkedIn the best place to go? Where would they find you?
Yes, absolutely. Or we have a website, becoming.international, so you can Google that and find us there.
Brilliant. We'll make sure we put the link in there when we release the podcast. But to all of the viewers, thank you so much for listening and tuning in for today's learning curve. We've got some more guests and personalities like Alison, who will be sharing some of their insights and wisdom around different topics around futurizing organizations and leadership. Again, thank you and goodbye.